The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian and thank you so much for tuning in again. The main event in this week's show is an interview with an English-born but now based in Dallas, Texas writer. Nick Redfern is his name and he's going to be talking about the Rendlesham Forest UFO conspiracy, which this year celebrates its 40th anniversary. But first, Lammas or Lughnasadh. Yes, the wheel of the year has turned another notch, and on the 1st of August, at least up here in the Northern Hemisphere, we celebrate the first of this summer's harvest festivals as we reach the midpoint between the longest day and the autumn equinox. In a moment, we'll have our old friend Naomi from Inanna's festival in Norwich to give us a Wiccan take on the festival. But before we do that, I was digging through my various reference books and found this snippet about the 1st of August, which is particularly pertinent in these days of Black Lives Matter. The 1st of August, 1834, was the year slavery came to an end within the British colonies. Although typically it was a political compromise, so it was actually only slaves under the age of 6 who were emancipated in 1834, with the remaining approximately 770,000, that's 750,000, going through a convoluted intermediary stage called apprenticeships, so they did not become fully free until either 1838 or 1840. And slaves in India in Ceylon were not emancipated for another 3 years until 1843. As for the compensation for former slave owners, the total agreed compensation bill was £20 million, which would be the equivalent of about £6 billion today, a sum so high that the British government, which had to raise a loan to fund the compensation, did not finish paying it off until 2015. Yes, just 5 years ago. Among the people receiving compensation for slave owning was the Bishop of Exeter, yes, a bishop of the Church of England, who owned 665 slaves in the West Indies. And politicians wonder today why people are still angry there are statues of prominent slave traders standing in English towns and cities. Anyway, now here's Naomi.
Lughnasadh. Lughnasadh, I've heard people say more in Ireland than I have perhaps here. I think here many people would say Lammas, and they might not realise the origin of it, but that it is Old English and refers to Lammas, the mass of the loaf, and that of course is the clue. Finding out about Lammas some years ago as I was doing a big ceremony for people, the words Lord and Lady originated from Llafwyd and Llafdigger. Llafwyd was the guardian of the grain, the Lord, but it was the Llafdigger, the giver of the grain, the lady, who shared it out. And that to me is really what this festival symbolises to me. The intensity of the brightness of June sun is gone. Now it begins to mellow. It's still very warm. The evenings are still long, but they are noticeably drawing in. And now there is this kind of rich, golden glow in the air that brings us to this halfway point between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox. The first signs of the harvest are around us. The first harvests are being cut, so this is, of course, the festival of the corn dolly, taking those first ears of wheat or barley or rye or whatever your crop might be, even if it's decorative grasses in your back garden. You could tie and twist a little doubled over bundle into a little shape of a human being, poke through arms, divide off legs or leave them loose. I like mine to have little bits of leaf and flowers perhaps even in there. It's a nice little decorative addition to that symbol of the first signs of harvest. And even in the tiniest little back garden patch, even if your harvest of seeds that you see is but dandelion and buttercup, they are valuable plants, as we know, and you might choose to collect some little seeds. Maybe you walk past a little bit of grass or verd somewhere and you see a rosehip or two, or a hawthorn with some berries, or some little apples coming, but mostly it's the seeds that we're looking at. That idea that this is the new seeds forming now that will rest through the winter and then germinate in the spring. So it's about the harvest of our own lives. What are we looking at having almost completed or seeing results of at this time? I like that thought. So to celebrate for people, if they want to create a little simple Lammas ceremony, of course, grains of any kind that you could eat and make into a little shape, a symbolic design, twisted, plaited, or a little female or male figure. You can also think of the other things that we get from grain, not just bread, but of course beer, and the stories of John Barleycorn, the moment at which the god is cut from his knees and offers himself as nourishment and tasty beer perhaps as well. But it is the goddess that is the provider. It is she who's kept those lands fertilized and moistened with rain and allowed everything to ripen. So it's thanks to her that we look at all of the development and growth in nature around us. And whether it's vegetables or fruits, seeds, nuts, berries, whatever is now ripe, we could include as part of a Lammas celebratory meal. And also that awareness of heat and water. Last summer, very hot, very dry. This summer, also very hot and perhaps not quite so dry, but certainly extended periods of dryness. So to think about how water needs to return to the land, how we do still need rain to fill out the fruits and the seeds and the vegetables, but not to drown them. So it's that fine balance again of what we need and what we might end up with. And psychologically, I think this is a point. People have perhaps passed exams and thinking about what their next step will be. Will it be more study? Will it be a job? Will it be travel? What will their harvest of this year be? And perhaps also to think about that is something that we can all do. What is the crop of our life that we've grown this year? How can that be reflected in the season around us? And whatever those plans are, whether they're busy plans, introspective, creative, practical, that again we also want to take time to appreciate the season and to enjoy the hum of the bees and the tweeting of the birds, and in my case the whining of the cats and the hedgehogs as they come for their nightly food, and how all of that is part of our own cycle of the journey for this year. It's a new moon just literally as we move into August, so it's a fresh start emotionally, it's new beginnings again. So yeah, there are ways in which things are ending, but new things are always beginning. But that shift from bud to flower to seed or fruit or berry, that's a really powerful image, I think. So maybe make some little table decorations or carry a few little dried seeds in your pocket to remind you What are the seeds of things that you will be holding in life through the autumn and the winter? And this is only the first of 3 harvest festivals.
Yes.
So Lammas or Lughnasadh now, and of course people can look up Lugh, the Welsh god of light and fire, and there are variations and stories and myths and legends all across the UK for him. We can look at the holly and the oak king, having now shifted the balance of the sun. We're now waning half of the year. Holly king now has that golden sun wheel. And we can look at goddess and abundance, goddesses like Pomona of the apples, and create something that reminds us of that fruition and wholeness and sweetness and deliciousness of life. And then, of course, will come the fullness of the harvest. Autumn equinox, many people will call it Mabon, when day and night are again the same length for that night, and then we move on to the third and last of the harvest festivals, the closing of the old year, Samhain, Halloween. But for now, it's just beginning to see all of those fields with their riches, with their treasure. And I think to think about what is treasure in our lives as well. What would we like to keep as treasure? What can be that golden, glowing richness?
Here's our interview with this week's guest, Nick Redfern. Nick has been interested in UFOs since the late 1970s. His main area of research centres around determining what has been learned about the UFO subject at an official level in Britain. He has spent hundreds of hours at the Public Record Office in London and uncovered thousands of pages of previously classified Royal Air Force, Air Ministry and Ministry of Defence files on UFOs dating back to the Second World War. Nick is the author of several best-selling books on UFOs, including The FBI Files, the FBI's UFO Top Secrets Exposed, and Cosmic Crashes, the incredible story of UFOs that fell to Earth. Nick also lectures on UFO subjects both in the UK and in the US. In this interview, we are talking about UFOs, aliens, and, curiously, sea monsters. So, my great pleasure to be talking to Nick Redfern. Hello, Nick.
Hey, Charles. How's it going?
It's going fine, thank you very much. One of the topics I know you've written on and studied in the UK is the Rendlesham Forest UFO event, conspiracy, whatever, which for non-UK listeners is coming up to its 40th anniversary this Christmas, end of this year.
That's right.
For the sort of casual observer looking at it, it seems that a lot of the 40 years have been wasted by various people trying to score off points of each other, and some people who weren't even there claiming to be eyewitnesses. And so opportunities have been lost. But we sort of seem to run the gamut from it was purely natural phenomenon or the lighthouse nearby, or it was an actual UFO landing, or it was some kind of military incident between US and UK forces out in the woods having a bit of a rumble. And what's your take on it? Because I notice you used the phrase UFO conspiracy.
Yeah, well, I had a new book out just last month called The Rendlesham Forest UFO Conspiracy. And that looks at a completely different scenario. The idea that what actually occurred in the woods was like a top secret experiment involving holograms, and the scenario and the data that I've put together suggests that it was essentially like an experiment to determine how the human mind could be messed and played with by using sophisticated holographic technology, and that it was reportedly tested within the woods right outside of the bases, the two twin bases, and to see how how the guys would respond. Would they sort of freak out? Would they panic, or would they operate in the way that they would hope the troops would sort of respond? So in other words, it's sort of like a tale of like a psychological warfare program using experimental technology, and as I said, to see how the human mind reacts under extremely alternative circumstances.
Right. You think that is the most likely explanation?
Well, I think for me it is. I mean, when the book came out at the end of April, there was a great deal of debate, as you can probably imagine, when the book came out. And people were saying, well, this sounds interesting and plausible. Other people were saying, no, it was aliens, etc., etc. So I don't think, you can ever sort of nail it to one thing that is going to satisfy everybody. But one of the things that I point out, and a lot of people don't know this, that what you have around Rendlesham Forest, you have the twin bases which are now closed down, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. A lot of people don't realise or even know that going back to 1935, there's been multiple top-secret experiments, only sort of 4 or 5, 6 miles from Rendlesham Forest, going back, as I said, from 35 to the 1990s. For example, in 1935, the British government set up its first top-secret radar program called the Tizard Committee. This was like 5 miles from Rendlesham Forest. Then in the Second World War, there were rumours of a planned invasion by German personnel off the east coast of Suffolk late one night, and reportedly they actually got to the beach but were killed by some sort of strange technology that set the beach and the water and the German personnel on fire. And this is revolves around a little village called Shingle Street, and this was mid-40s when the war was going on. Shingle Street is like 4 miles from Rendlesham Forest. And then in the 60s, there was another top-secret radar program established in the area called Cobra Mist. And again, that's about 7 miles from Rendlesham Forest. So in other words, the whole area has been a hotbed for UK experimentation at a top-secret level since 1935. And when I point that out to people, a lot of them have sort of said, well, it's kind of like the penny drops when they realise that the events in 1980 were not the only ones or the first bizarre events to occur in that area. As I said, it goes back to the 30s with radar and all sorts of different top-secret experimentations. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think it probably was an experiment, because so many other experiments of varying ways have gone on in that area.
Yes, and of course, not that, well, it's a bit further away, is Orford Ness, which again is another area, and it's only relatively recently been opened to the public. Was an experimental military zone where, I think that started in the First World War, where they were testing various sound cannons and things, and then it went on to, again, radar, and then they had, you can still see them when you walk along there, the sort of bunkers for nuclear warfare and things. So, yes, it's a whole hive of activity down there.
Yeah, and I think, when you sort of put it in perspective and you realise, all this stuff has been going on for decades and decades, I find it very suspicious that of all the possible places a UFO could land in the UK would be Rendlesham Forest. And the more and more I dug into it, the more and more I found that in that era, the late 70s through the early 80s, a lot of research was being done in both the US and the UK to essentially create the ultimate holographic technology. Now, if you imagine, you're on the battlefield and the enemy unleashes a highly advanced holographic imagery in the skies or coming towards you, it could place the opposing side, to be totally stunned, and in a panic. So when you look at the time frame for that as well, somewhere like Rendlesham Forest, very, very close to the twin bases, late at night in the early hours, and run this experiment and see how the military personnel respond when they're suddenly faced with what looks like multiple UFO activity. And one of the intriguing things that's been said on many occasions is that a number of the guys who were out in the woods were baffled by the fact that the more senior personnel were not focusing on the alleged UFOs. They were focusing on the response of the younger guys who were out there, as if they were sort of carefully watching to see how they were responding to what seemed to be UFOs, but may not have been.
Yeah, so they were there as observers rather than participants, yes.
Yes, already aware.
Since then, as we know with the military, once they do something secret, they seem to be unable to ever fess up to it, and so it tends to get covered up, obscured and buried, and the truth never gets out, doesn't it?
Well, no, you're right, and I think one of the big problems with Rendlesham, and you could apply this to a lot of old cases like Roswell and other stories. One of the big problems, of course, is that Rendlesham isn't as old as Roswell. It won't be too long, with Roswell before we're pushing its 80th anniversary. It's not too far away. Now, as far as Rendlesham's concerned, it's 40 years ago. It's still quite a longer time ago now. And I think the big problem is that whether, people buy into the story that I presented in my book about, Rendlesham being an experiment, or somebody else thinks it's aliens or time travelers, the big problem for everybody is trying to figure out where the original documentation is, where the evidence is. And that's the big problem, the big stumbling block that everybody, regardless of which side of the coin, you're on, that's the big problem, is trying to find these files. Barely anything has surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, which doesn't surprise me, when these stories and these events were probably buried, to the ultimate degree. So I think the challenge now, again, whichever side of the coin you're on, the challenge for all of us should be to try and find the evidence that really sort of nails it down for us to this or that.
What about the attitude of the relevant UK organisations? So we're talking about the military, the Royal Air Force, the Ministry of Defence, etc. What's their view? Because it seems to be that sometimes they're being helpful, sometimes they're not, and sometimes it's quite clearly they're just putting out information and it's the usual, weather balloons type of thing. What's been your experience doing the research? Because I know you've spent a long time in places like the Public Records Office digging through the files.
Well, in the US, there was a Freedom of Information Act long before there was one in the UK.
Yeah.
But it was in the early 1990s when the National Archives, as it's called now, before that it was the Public Record Office, but the National Archive started to release files in 1993. And at that time, before there was the Freedom of Information Act in the UK, they had the 30-year ruling. That meant that when the 1993 came around, the files from 1963 started to surface. So And that continued until the latter part of the 1990s. And then when freedom of information legislation started to get passed, what happened then was that more and more files surfaced. And if a lot of people have said, well, it's just, the only ones they've revealed are, cases where somebody saw a strange light in the sky, but that's actually not true. I mean, there are some really interesting, particularly radar reports down at the National Archives, and pilots being scrambled to chase these things. I mean, that's not hearsay. You can go down and read the files in the National Archives, but a lot of people just assume there's nothing like that. But if you go down there, there's plenty of weird stuff in those files. Crop circle reports from 1964 in the north part of England, all sorts of different things. However, the really controversial cases, you're right, that we're not getting too much along those lines. And certainly when it comes to Rendlesham, really nothing of any great significance has surfaced. The British Ministry of Defence's stance on Rendlesham is that there was no sort of national security issue, no defence problems or anything like that, and so there was no point in investigating it. And that has been primarily their approach since 1980 and to this very day now. And, some military people, for example, have quite rightly said, well, even if no damage was done and nobody was killed or injured or anything like that, just the fact that a UFO may have come down, that in itself should have been, something that would affect the defence of the country. But the Ministry of Defence don't take that approach. They just solely say, well, nothing happened, nobody was hurt, so there was no national security issue, which is really kind of like sort of Weasley way of getting out of dealing with it. And
Yes.
even the material that has surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, there's no smoking gun or anything like that. So that makes me think that there probably is, whether it was a UFO or a secret experiment, I think somewhere there's probably like a very deeply buried organisation which is sitting on these files, but we don't know who it is. It may not even be the MOD. I mean, it could be the intelligence services, MI5 or somebody like that.
Have there been any, other than your book, any other recent developments regarding it? Any new information come out about it?
Yeah, I mean, that is what it is. But I would definitely say that, when it gets to December and it's the 40th anniversary, I'm pretty sure then, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if a few people haven't, got book ideas coming out to coincide with the 40th anniversary. That wouldn't surprise me, if at least one or two books don't come out.
Yeah.
I should stress I don't know if anybody actually is, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
And hopefully, again, regardless of which side you're on, hopefully, we'll get more and more data and more information that will allow us to sort of put a greater picture together. So I think kind of like when every 10 anniversaries, every the 10th anniversary or the 20th anniversary of any major case,
Yes.
it always gets a lot of coverage, and I'm sure when December comes, it'll be guaranteed to be like that. So.
Yeah. Now, switching to one of your other books, and this is one I've recently purchased, and it's called The Alien Book, A Guide to Extraterrestrial Beings on Earth. Now, what's intriguing in this is you take a historical view, so you are looking at ancient Egypt and some of the things that happened down there and where their ideas came from. You're looking at Mesopotamia and the dawn of history, if you like, the Anunnaki ancients and the like. But you also take a perspective that some of what we regard as cryptids, some form of cryptozoology, may themselves actually not be unknown UK creatures, but may actually be alien, and you even have the Loch Ness Monster in there.
Yeah, when the publisher said to me, they wanted to put out a book on sort of history of aliens, I said to them, well, yeah, I'd be interested in doing it, but there's no point sort of just going over old ground and just sort of telling abduction story after abduction story, of the greys, these little creatures with the black eyes. I said I would do the book if I could have sort of complete control to demonstrate to the reader that there are multiple different types of aliens reported and all around the world. It's not just, the sort of, as I said, the black-eyed little dwarfish creatures of alien abduction lore. And so that's what I decided to do, was to look at all the different angles. And I mean, when you talk about these sort of cryptid creatures, which is, for people who don't know the subject, cryptozoology is the study of unknown animals. And one of the ones I talk about in the UK is a creature that's become known as Owlman. And if you Google Owlman Cornwall, you'll see the stories of this sort of legendary glowing-eyed winged humanoid creature that's been seen since the 1970s in and around the area of Mornan in Cornwall. And what's interesting is there's been a number of UFO activity in that very same area as well. And sort of on a similar angle, when you look at the story of the Loch Ness Monster, or monsters, Loch Ness itself is a very strange place. For example, there's been multiple UFO activity over the loch going back to the 1960s, and a famous Nessie investigator named Ted Holliday was actually threatened on the shores of Loch Ness by nothing less than a man in black. So you have a lot of weird stuff where you have these spillovers, if you like, from ufology into cryptozoology. And you find that quite often in these sort of realms of investigation. I mean, looking over the other side of the pond, you've got Mothman, which is very similar to the Owlman in the UK. And Mothman was this, again, like a winged humanoid creature with glowing red eyes that was seen in and around the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, from 1966 to 67, and it was made into a big Hollywood movie in the early 2000s. So, these strange humanoid kind of creatures and the similar ones, these strange animals that at first glance seem to be just a zoological mystery, actually do sort of cross over into the UFO issue as well.
Yes, you are a little bit cruel there where you talk about cryptozoologists and you say it's a rather, let me just dig it out, it's a rather pompous term for monster hunters.
Well, I mean cryptozoology, it does explain what it means.
Yes. But
it kind of implies that you can go to university and get a degree in it because it's an ology. But it does. For me, I tell you as it is. I'd much rather the term use like monster hunter or creature seeker, because cryptozoology just to me is a little bit pompous and self-important.
Yes, it's a bit like everybody nowadays is a paranormal researcher, but back when I was at university, we were ghost hunters.
I'm not sort of denigrating the field, because I'm in the field as well. But I just think that like I said, it's calling it cryptozoology to me is just a bit self-important and pompous. So.
Now, interestingly, with regards your book, there was a report that was published in the Astrophysical Journal saying that they reckon there are at least 36 intelligent alien civilizations in our galaxy. which seems to be echoing that this multitude of alien-type extraterrestrial beings that may be on Earth or have visited it over the centuries, there's no shortage of alien species out there who could fit the book, as opposed to the usual reptilians or little greys with big black eyes type of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the, as I said, that's one of the main reasons why I was, pleased that they allowed the publisher, let me go where I wanted to go with the book. And that whole issue of, potential 36, sort of alien civilizations, I mean, I think to a degree it's sort of a stretch, actually saying it's round about 36. I mean, it could be 236, it could be 15, But the important thing is that what I particularly like about this debate and this revelation, this news story, is the fact that it was actually taken very seriously. And that's one of the things that I've seen develop more and more, certainly over the last 10, 15 years, where research into UFOs and alien life is being taken far more seriously versus, say 25 years ago, when if you were into UFOs, you were sort of the local town eccentric, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So I think just the fact that, we're seeing debates and papers being put out there, and reports, and it's getting not just into, the last story on the news, finally, it's not like that anymore. Today, it's more along the lines of, well, this is really interesting, and it's actually a lot of this has become mainstream media coverage, and the idea that there could be, several dozen civilizations within our, I won't say our neighborhood, because, I mean, it's still a huge distance away. But, I mean, it is certainly, it's opening the doors at least and putting it out for people to see.
Let's switch to a couple of your other books. You've got a new one coming out called Monsters of the Deep. Tell us about that one.
Yeah.
That's lake monsters and sea serpents and things of that nature.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've written a couple of books like this. I did one on the Loch Ness monster called Nessie a few years ago, and this is the next one. And I've always had a sort of an interest in this phenomenon. When I was about 4 or 5, my parents took me on a week's holiday to Scotland, and we spent a day at Loch Ness. And my dad told me the story of the Loch Ness Monster, and I still have a few fragmented memories of me standing on the shore of Loch Ness, and my dad telling me the story of the Loch Ness Monster, and then it sort of really, excited me. And when I was about, 7, 8, 9, I started to read kids' books on monsters and things like that, and I've never forgot that first time that I went to Loch Ness, and so that I've always had that interest, and that's really, I guess, what sort of prompted this new book, Monsters of the Deep, and again, kind of like with the Alien book, I didn't just want to focus on, the famous ones like Nessie and Ogopogo in the US. What I wanted also to do was to demonstrate some of the lesser-known stories, and also lesser-known creatures, and some of them I include in the book, like sea serpents and lake monsters, are sort of definitively unidentified creatures, but I've also included in the book genuine cases of, like, for example, of gigantic octopus and gigantic squid and gigantic eels. So we're also talking about creatures that come under the category of monsters because they've grown and grown to huge sizes. And I think some lake monsters and sea serpents probably really are, oversized versions of regular animals in the waters, but they come across as what we would call monsters. For example, there've been a number of reports over the years of lake monsters in the UK, which aren't, aside from Nessie, there's a number of Scottish lakes that have their own traditions. For example, like Lochmora has a creature known as Morag, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of these, at least, are not giant eels. A number of witnesses have described something that sounds sort of eerily like a giant eel. Now, the largest eels on record are about 14 or 15 feet long. But, if you've got something along the sort of proportions of 30 feet, with a body the size of a barrel, you're probably not going to quibble that that's a monster, even if it's just a giant eel,
Well, I mean, you have the same with the giant squids, which were thought to be just old sea tails until some of them or parts of them have been recovered. And I mean, one of the problems, obviously, is that they live very deep down and are rarely caught and rarely seen. And but I mean, that's something that's moved from being purely the realms of fiction and 20,000 Leagues Beneath the Sea, that type of thing, and dragging ships down to, well, there really are these huge things down there.
Well, yeah, you're right. And I think that at least some of these stories, when I say stories, real events, but, sailors back then didn't know necessarily what they were actually seeing. And so I think some of these stories of giant squid and massive octopus and things like this probably prompted some of the stories, like, for example, the legendary Kraken. Now, the Kraken, was this huge creature that sort of swam in the waters of Scandinavia. And, it's become part of pop culture now in movies and things like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of these reports did prompt the stories and the legends of the Kraken. And somebody tells the story to somebody else, and it gets a little bit bigger when somebody else tells it to somebody else. Kind of like the fisherman and the fish that got away.
It was this big. It was this big. Yes.
Yes, so I think a lot of these stories of so-called sea monsters, I think the stories are genuine, but sometimes it's inevitable that there's going to be exaggeration and distortion as the times and generations go along. But that said, I mean, the planet itself, our planet, the Earth, I mean, the vast majority of it is water. And even more intriguing is that a lot of it is barely ever investigated. So there's no reason why there could be, things that we haven't even necessarily come across. And there's also the issue of animals that, we assume have become extinct, but may actually have survived, that presumed extinction.
I mean, again, classic is the coelacanth, armoured fish that thought to have been extinct millions of years ago and then was fished up in 1930s off South Africa, I think.
And that's a perfect example of how, nature often finds ways to, survive and against all the odds. And I mean, a lot of people talk about, like, the Loch Ness monsters being surviving plesiosaurs. That's one case where I sort of take the other approach. I don't think they are plesiosaurs for one particular reason. Plesiosaurs were not fish. They were marine reptiles. So, in other words, being reptiles, like a crocodile, they would have to keep surfacing at least once every 30 minutes or so. A crocodile can sort of go underwater 30, 40 minutes. So if we were to speculate that a plesiosaur, which was also a marine reptile like a crocodile, we should be seeing, and if there's a colony, let's say, of 10 or 15 Nessies in the loch, each of one of those 10 or 15 would have to be surfacing about every 30 minutes to take in air because, as I said, they're not fish. So, and the other big stumbling block is the fact that the plesiosaurs lived in the oceans, and which is salt water, and Loch Ness is freshwater.
Yeah.
And that's another problem, most fish cannot adapt from salt to freshwater and vice versa. Some can, but most can't.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Thanks to coronavirus, bats have been in the news recently. Are they the natural source of COVID-19, or did Chinese mad scientists experiment on bat virus and accidentally, or deliberately, depending upon your choice of conspiracy theories, release a genetically mutated version of the virus into the wild? Now, bats do seem to get a bad press, and here's another story about bats being exploited to bring grief to the human race. And my thanks to Anne Steele, one of our regular listeners, for drawing my attention to the following story about an attempt by the Americans to firebomb Japan in World War II with tiny, tiny incendiary bombs attached to bats. Yes, I said bats, which you might think sums up the whole idea. All begins in December 1941 when a Pennsylvania dentist called Adams is on holiday in New Mexico and visits the famed Carlsbad Caverns, which are home to about 1 million bats. Adams seems to have been particularly impressed with what he saw from the bats, so when he heard the news that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and thereby starting off America's involvement in World War II, it got him thinking. Less than a month later, in January 1942, he sent the White House his plan. We could, he said, demolish Japanese cities by strapping tiny incendiary bombs to bats, which they could then carry into all the nooks and crannies of the cities on the island. Think of thousands of fires breaking out simultaneously over a circle of 40 miles in diameter. For every bomb dropped, Japan could be devastated, yet with a small loss of life. Now, as luck would have it, Adams happened to know the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. So when he finished his proposals, he was able to get them in front of a high-level audience, despite the rather eccentric nature of the idea. His proposal was taken up by the National Research Defense Committee, which was in charge of coordinating and investigating research into war-applicable ideas. They forwarded the proposal to a certain Donald Griffin, who was involved in animal research, and Griffin was also enthusiastic about the idea. Griffin said, "This proposal seems bizarre and visionary at first glance." He probably doesn't speak like that. He wrote in April 1942, "But extensive experience with experimental biology convinces me that if executed competently, it would have every chance of success." The president's men followed Griffin's lead. "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into," said one presidential memorandum. And so the dentist's crazy idea about bats became a government-funded research project. After the team had settled on using a Mexican free-tailed bats, Adams took a few to Washington for a demonstration of them carrying dummy bombs. His superiors were sufficiently impressed that the US Air Force gave authority for more detailed research to commence. The project was known as Project X-Ray, and it was to determine the feasibility of using bats to carry small incendiary bombs to bomb enemy targets. After being transferred to the Army, you might think that maybe the Air Force thought this is a daft idea, and offloaded it to another branch of the services. Thousands of bats were captured with nets at caverns around the southwest of the US. Tiny bombs were designed for them. But this was a complex system, and researchers also needed to work out how to transport and deploy the bats. The problem being that bats could not fly all the way across the Pacific from the United States to Japan. The idea they came up was to keep the bats in hibernating mode while they were being shipped. To accomplish this, they stuck the bats in ice cube trays and cooled them down. They also had to figure out how to release the bats in midair and came up with an idea of cardboard containers with springs on them that would open up at a certain point and release the bats. Unfortunately, a real test did not go as planned, and in one incident, a few of the loaded incendiary bats were accidentally released on a base, causing a hangar and a general's car to be bombed and burned out. More tests were conducted in December 1943. This is now some 2 years after Adams first pitched his idea to the White House. But after 30 demonstrations and trials and the expenditure of $2 million, which is a lot of money in those days, the project was cancelled. Why? The suggestion is, although the idea still had legs, or at least wings, by 1943 the focus had shifted from deploying thousands of tiny bat bombs to dropping a handful of great big atom bombs on Japan. And so we entered the atomic age, not the bat age. And now for another instalment of our Fabulous Creatures feature, which is based on a column I write for the Ancient Origins magazine. And the fabulous creature this time around is the Gremlin, here to blight our technology. Now, unlike all the other creatures we've encountered so far in this series, the Gremlin is the new imp on the paranormal block. One hardly anyone had heard of just 100 years ago, but one that now gets blamed for every mishap we encounter in the modern world, from trains running late to our computers crashing. In terms of their origins, they can be traced back to the early days of the RAF, that's the Royal Air Force, in World War I, when engineers and pilots would notice that sometimes aircraft would not fly properly for reasons that were neither a mechanical problem nor human error. But what was it? An English magazine article in 1917 referred to the existence of a horde of mysterious and malicious spirits whose purpose in life was to bring about as many as possible of the inexplicable mishaps which, in those early days as now, trouble an airman's life. By the early 1920s, RAF pilots stationed in Malta, the Middle East and India were privately talking of gremlins attempting to harm them and their aircraft, and in 1923 a British pilot who crashed into the sea specifically blamed gremlins for the accident, saying they'd caused cockpit chaos and engine sabotage. An issue of the journal Aeroplane, published in 1929, contained a poem. It described gremlins as a flyer's nemesis, and by 1939 the word had made its first appearance in Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable. By 1942, so we're now into World War II, the notoriety of gremlins had spread to the United States, where first Walt Disney and later Roald Dahl popularized the name and their antics. After that, books, including Dahl's own children's novel The Gremlins, comics, cartoons, all followed. Then, much later, came the 1963 television episode of The Twilight Zone, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, starring a very young William Shatner, seeing an evil gremlin attempting to rip an engine from the wing of the airliner in which Shatner was flying. And then, of course, in 1984, we had Steven Spielberg's first outing of his hit movie series, Gremlins. But where does the name Gremlin come from? Despite being such a recent addition to the canon of fabulous creatures, there is no universally accepted explanation. Some say it derives from the Old English word gremian, meaning to vex or annoy, whereas others say it's a mashup between goblins and Fremlin's beer, which was widely available on RAF bases in the Middle East in the 1920s. Goblins, beer, Gremlins, yeah, see where that comes from. What do they look like? Curiously, most victims may know what gremlins are, and may know they're at work, but few see the perpetrators of the mischief, so descriptions vary. They are typically said to be between 6 inches and 2 feet in height, with skin that is blue, green or grey in colour. They also have hairy, bat-like ears and wear a wide variety of colourful and eccentric clothing, while those who plague aircraft also have unusually large feet with suction pads on their soles, so they can walk along the outside of an aircraft while their plane is in flight. Incidentally, young female gremlins are called flipperty-gibbets, while baby males are called widgets. And as mentioned at the outset, they have diversified over the years, spreading their malign influence from not just aircraft to all types of modern technology. Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud in their Oxford Dictionary of English Folklore says there is even a subspecies of gremlin that specialises in creating typos and misprints in books and newspapers. But I find that hard to believe. Once again, a big thank you to Nick Redfern. Nick will be back next week for a final 15 minutes of the interview, which we didn't have space for today, when he'll be talking about his series of books on the Men in Black and Black-Eyed Children. In the meantime, you can find out more about Nick and his books by checking out his website at nickredfern40.blogspot.com. I'll give you that one again. Nick Redfern, that's Redfern, Fortean, Fortean, .blogspot.com. And that's it. Almost time to go. But before we do, let's talk about Apocalypse bingo cards. Apocalypse what, you ask? Okay, here's the thing. If you look on social media, particularly Facebook, well, at least the Facebook groups I belong to, you'll see many people are running buzzword bingo cards for what will be the next new disasters to afflict planet Earth and the human race. My favourite new affliction, which I spotted in a report last week, is that the public health officials in a town just west of Denver, Colorado, have reported that squirrels have tested positive for bubonic plague. Yes, those cutesy little squirrels are spreading the Black Death. Perhaps we should take a leaf out from the Australians who call grey squirrels tree rats. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying, until the next time we're together, stay well, stay weird, stay different, and don't feed the squirrels.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.